Well, hey there, idiots. Welcome back to Observe. In today's video, we're going to be analyzing the nonverbal communication of Jeffrey Dahmer. This is not the first video that I've done on him, but more on that in just a second. Let's go ahead and roll the intro first. Okay, so as I said, this is not the first video that I have done on Jeffrey Dahmer. I have done a series on both him and his parents and talking about some of the dynamics and interdynamics between them. But today's video is an interview, a not very well covered interview. I've only found it on a few places throughout the internet, and I have not done an analysis of it here on the channel, but it's of him and his dad sitting down together for an interview. It lends towards some interesting interdynamics between the two of them, and it still opens up a little bit of an understanding to the function behind the actions of Jeffrey Dahmer. I think that's all of the backstory that I'll give for this one. If you want more of that, go and check out the other videos first. That being said, let's go ahead and jump right into at least the first part of this very lengthy interview. I've broken it up. If you like it, we'll do more. Let's begin.
Hi, Jeff. Sherry, how are you? Yeah. Good to see you. It's good to see you.
Hi, Joe. It's Mr. Phillips.
Hi, Mr. Phillips. How are you?
Good to see you. Spending the last few days with your folks,
Great.
talking about a lot of different things.
Hey, you're lucky you came up on a day when there's no snow. It was snowing like crazy all weekend.
Is that right?
You know?
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and pause here. Fascinating nonverbal communication from Jeffrey to begin with. He walks in and he's very confident. You don't see him shuffling in. He's got a decently relaxed stride. He goes in for a confident handshake. And then the audio falls apart a little bit because this is a really old interview, obviously. But he also knows the people by their first names, letting us know that he had some preparation as to who he was going to be talking to. And he immediately falls into this small talk banter, which lets us know that even with his functionality day to day, he understood social norms and how to fall in place with those social norms, even comfortably so, even in an area that this is obviously a unique situation, to be sitting down with your dad, talking to a person who's interested in asking you about why you're a cannibal. It's a fascinating dynamic that he's working with, but even still, he has very overtly controlled social behavior. And I think that that characterizes Jeffrey Dahmer throughout the entirety of his story. He has this overt social control. We'll see some various fascinating elements of his psyche come out as he's talking about them. And it's just interesting. Let's continue.
How are things going here for you?
Slow and steady. Nothing out of the ordinary, really.
You've read the
Slow and steady. He has a fall off in pitch. Not a lot of force behind that. To me, that indicates a level of negative sentiment or emotion around that statement. Slow and steady. Then he does a very overt mouth shrug and lip compression in there, which is, I don't know. When you see a mouth shrug in there, it's the same as seeing a normal shrug or a partial shrug. It's that I don't know sentiment. And so we see that, and then he says nothing out of the ordinary, really. To me, basing off of the fall off of pitch and then that little mouth shrug in there, I'm not buying that statement, that not too much out of the ordinary. I feel like perhaps things have been a little bit less pleasant for him, but maybe that's what he's considering out of the ordinary, so it still would line up. Regardless, non-verbally speaking, that cluster there pushes me a little bit away from that statement of, yeah, slow and steady, nothing out of the ordinary. Fascinating, let's continue.
You've read the book?
Yes, I read the book. My dad sent it to me about last week, and spent all night reading it. Was up all night reading it.
A lot of ums and uhs where he didn't have that before. I read the book, this repetition. He's buying time, having verbal difficulty. You see even a lopsided shrug there towards the very end where he was saying, I stayed up all night reading it. That little lopsided shrug. To me, that indicates that he had a decent amount of agitation around that. The lopsided shrug indicates either insecurity or insincerity. Maybe he didn't read the entire book. Maybe he was feeling insecure about what the book was stating, but he's saying that he read the book, had verbal difficulty with it, had some nonverbal indicators of insecurity or insincerity. It's fascinating nonverbally. Let's continue.
It was quite a surprise to me, some parts of it. Very interesting.
In what sense?
Uh, just some of the things that were revealed caught me off guard, and just some very big surprises in it for me.
What was it that took you off guard?
Some of his insights into what he thought of me as I was growing up.
Okay, so with that, that does explain contextually, as he's saying there were some prizes, some surprises that he interacted with and came into contact with as he was reading the book. It's in regards to what his dad said while writing the book. So with that, it would make sense, even with that as the emotional starting point for this, that there wouldn't be a lot of camaraderie interaction between him and his dad. I would expect to see that non-verbally through various things, perhaps through the positioning, through verbal intonation, things like that. You might see that separation between Jeff and his dad. We'll see how that plays out.
All set? Everybody ready? Okay, let's all take a deep breath. Your dad comes here to visit about once a month, but I get the impression that the two of you don't talk a lot about everything that happened, about the crimes in particular.
No, we don't discuss that because it's been gone over so thoroughly in the papers and the media that there's just really no point in going into any in-depth talks about it. We talk about our family, home, how things used to be, what prison life is like here now, and try to keep things as light and upbeat as possible.
Is it hard?
All right, so pausing here. Jeffrey's nonverbal communication is indicating a little bit of desire to separate himself from his dad. If you see his dad sitting very relaxed in the chair, takes a swig of water at the beginning, this is likely due to agitation and nerves. It's a fairly broadcasted interview. There's going to be some nerves. Jeffrey doesn't have any indicators like that, which is one of those insider looks into his mind. He doesn't seem to be rattled by many things. Jeffrey doesn't, which it makes sense contextually with even the kind of person that he is. Now, non-verbally speaking, you see him in his chair. He's leaning ever so slightly away from his dad, whereas his dad's sitting center of gravity, very centered in the chair. Jeffrey is leaning a little bit away. So that, to me, indicates perhaps a level of that separation that we were talking about earlier, with the emotional side of the interview being set by Jeffrey being taken aback by some of the things that his dad said in this book that he wrote. And we're seeing that non-verbally throughout that. And then we're hearing him talk about the topics that they talk about during their visits, which apparently his dad visited every single week. So it's fascinating to see that his dad visited weekly, but there's still this level of separation. And I feel like that probably characterized their relationship up until Jeffrey's death, as there would be an obvious level of separation between the two. Speaking on his father's nonverbal communication, you could see very frequent blinking, which that frequent blinking indicates a level of psychological processing. People will blink at an average rate, and then if you see anything freeze from that or spike from that, that indicates a level of agitation with various emotional veins that stray from that. So we're seeing that increase in blinking, which means an increase of thought. It is fascinating. Let's continue on through this.
Is it hard for you to go back and talk about those things?
No.
Just from that response, how long the response is. Is it difficult for you to go back and talk about those things, in case you didn't catch that? Jeffrey's response is a long period of thinking, which lets us know that he's weighing his words fairly heavily. But then when he closes his mouth, he has a little slight indicator of possible contempt, as one side of the mouth is activated a little bit more than the other side. And to me, that indicates that perhaps there's not actually a level of consternation about going back and talking about these things. He's not troubled by these things. But let's hear what he says verbally instead of what his nonverbals are indicating.
No, not the good things. In fact, it gives me a sense of comfort to talk about the few good times there were in the past.
You say the few good times. Do you think of your childhood as having been profoundly unhappy?
No, not profoundly. My childhood wasn't filled with any great tragedies or anything. There were good times and there were bad times.
All right, so at the beginning there, after he answers the initial question, you see a number of self-soothing gestures. He's talked about how it's not that difficult for him to go back and talk about the okay things, and that makes sense with the possible contempt that we saw, the moral and intellectual superiority that he felt earlier. His response was no to the question, and it's not bad to talk about the good things. And then he has a number of agitation tells with the lip licks and various movements of the mouth there, indicating self-soothing and manipulators centered around that agitation. And then he starts going off into answering the question of whether or not his childhood was really that difficult. And he says no. And from what I can see, again, the resolution's it's awful. So from what I can see, he has synchronized nonverbal communication with what he's saying there. I don't actually believe that he thought that his childhood was that awful. As he's saying positives, he nods. As he's saying negatives, he shakes his head. He has an area where he's talking about, I don't know, I don't feel like there were too many bad things, and he has a mouth shrug in there. All of these are synchronized with what he's stating. So from what I understand, Jeffrey didn't feel like his entire situation that he became at the end of things was due exclusively to his childhood, which some people have pushed that this was largely a nurture thing, that he started off a certain way and because of his bad childhood, he became this certain thing. I don't believe that he feels that way himself, that he probably feels that there was some of the nature involved as well and not just exclusively nurture. Regardless, let's continue.
Times. I think it was fairly normal.
Jeff, do you remember your
That I don't actually necessarily buy. One, because the qualifier fairly. He says, I think it was fairly normal. Also, a little bit of drop in force behind his words as he's saying that, indicating perhaps a lack of sincerity with that, or a lack of confidence would be a way of looking at it. He's saying fairly with less projection, so perhaps he's not feeling like that was the case. And then you see a little bit of agitation creep into the lower half of his body as his legs shift around a little bit. To me, I feel like perhaps he did feel like he had an abnormal childhood, but as per earlier, that it wasn't an all bad situation, or that the childhood that he had wasn't the sole reason for how he ended up. Fascinating non-verbally what we're seeing. Let's continue.
remember your earliest experience and earliest interest, fascination with the inside of animals? Where that came from?
Okay, earliest, and we start to see a pretty overt postural change here. This is letting us know non-verbally. It's a non-verbal indicator towards a role switch within Jeffrey's mind, his psychology. He's going to switch from listening into speaking and putting himself back into a historical point in his own lifetime. Anytime that a person has to switch roles, be it in a conversation, be it energetically, anything like that, you'll see that postural change. It's a very reliable tell to see when a person's ready to switch up things, even if they don't speak. If you see a person-to-person interaction kind of thing, and you see somebody do a big postural change in there, that's not indicated by any other physical discomfort or anything along those lines, then you can fairly reasonably rely on the fact that they're preparing for a role change in that interaction. So we see that. Now he's going to start talking about his stuff.
In ninth grade, in biology class, we had the usual dissection of fetal pigs. I took the remains of that home and kept the skeleton of it. And I just started branching out, dogs, cats. I suppose it could have turned into a normal hobby like taxidermy, but it didn't. It veered off into this.
All right, so throughout that, you see the no shake that's consistently in there. It's just big enough to be possibly macro. Again, for those of you who do not know, the larger the movement, the more likely and easily controlled it is. So if you see somebody doing very overt motions with their body, they can more easily control those things. If you start to see super, super small, minute movements, those ones are more difficult to control consciously, especially in areas like interviews or high pressure situations. Your psyche is already so focused on trying to present in a specific way for those that the smaller things often go by the wayside. So we see that it seems to be walking the fence of micro to macro. If it's a macro, then it would be related to the you wouldn't believe, which makes sense absolutely contextually, as he's saying, yeah, I would do this and this and this, and each of them are kind of interesting characteristics about a child. Not a lot of people go and take the bodies from their dissection class in biology and take it home and wait till you have the skeleton and things like that. That's not as common. And so during that, you see him shaking his head as perhaps you wouldn't believe. The other possibility with that, if it was more of a micro, that could be an indicator of a desynchronization point, as he's saying he did a thing but was leaking that he didn't do a thing. Now, since there is concrete physical evidence and eyewitnesses to the alternate side of things, where he's saying that he did do these things and you might not believe it, that's going to be the avenue that we're pushed down, because it makes sense contextually with what we're already given outside of that as well. So we're seeing that no shake in there, as he's saying that it might be unbelievable, which then the reason that this is important is because it lets us know that Jeffrey, even at this point here, he understood that his mindset, his functioning of things was not the norm. It's not how most people function, and he never strayed away from that. He always accepted that how he functioned was different from the people around him, and he never even tried to shy away from it. He never tried to divert attention. He never tried to say, oh, I was pretty much a normal guy and it was all everybody else's fault, anything along those lines. He always maintained responsibility and an acknowledgement that how he functioned and processed through things psychologically was not the norm for the people around him. Let's continue.
Why, I don't know. All I know is that I wanted to see what the insides of these animals looked like.
Was there some pleasure in the cutting open of the animal?
Yes, there was. No sexual pleasure, but just it's hard to describe.
Sense of power, sense of control?
I suppose that's a good way of putting it, yeah.
All right, non-verbally speaking, he responds to that question of, was there a sense of pleasure in doing these actions? Very quick. He didn't have to think about it. It wasn't something that he had to plan out. He wasn't weighing his responses. He does in many other questions. You can tell that Jeffrey weighs his responses before he says them in many instances. In this one, it was just a very quick yes. Yes, it was. There was a sense of pleasure about this. Absolutely. Synchronized nonverbal communication with this. And then when asked to clarify, was it perhaps a sense of power? Again, we see the synchronized nonverbal communication throughout that, which that did characterize Jeffrey largely, was this sense of he wanted to control things. He wanted to have this sense of power, which there are a number of psychological things that can lend towards that, both in the nurture and nature side of things. In a family dynamic, if a child is left feeling very powerless or voiceless, oftentimes in their adult life, they will seek out avenues to exude power and to feel power that they perhaps didn't feel as a child. Now, this can be done in healthy ways, and it can be done in very unhealthy ways as well, which is where obviously Jeffrey lies, is in the unhealthy way of dealing with this feeling of lack of power. But then that also doesn't exclude the possibility of just an innate need for power within him. Perhaps for him, he just functions psychologically in a way that seeks after power. This is not unheard of. Let's continue.
I can sort of see a fascination for, wanting to see or for looking at the insides of animals, say for the first time.
Now, non-verbally speaking, as he's talking here, we're seeing his dad's head move around a lot. So it's not a yes and it's not a no. And to me, the circular motion indicates a waffling in between the two. So it indicates to me a level of insecurity in what's being said. Along with that, verbally, it's synchronized with saying, I can sort of see how ... So we're seeing that from him, but due to the overt nature of his nonverbal communication, indicating this lack of security or sincerity, not really feeling what he's saying here, that pushes me to believe that the following statement from his dad is going to be challenging to what he just stated. He said that he could see it. I'm betting there's going to be a but ... side of things, just speaking non-verbally from what we've seen here. Let's see.
After you did it one time, what more is to be gained by looking at another dog's inside, the second or
I
the
don't know.
third.
I don't know. It became a compulsion, and it switched from animals to humans. I
So with that, that's a pretty small no shake that Jeff has while he's saying, I don't know, that I don't know. And that's synchronized. So with that, unfortunately, I'm pushed to believe that he might actually not fully understand why, at least from his current state of psychology. Now, there's the possibility, and it's not unheard of for people to be able to even kind of shoehorn themselves into corners where they genuinely believe things that at one point they did know, but now either because it's not something that they can really hold comfortably, or it's something that's not acceptable, or something that they dislike about themselves, that they end up pushing themselves into the state of willingly being ignorant of their own reasonings behind things. But non-verbally speaking, we're seeing that, and then we see a little shrug in there as he's saying, I don't know as well. So that little cluster of, I don't know, with a shrug in there, that indicates sincerity to me. I don't actually believe that Jeffrey knew why he did what he did. It's just something that he did do, which that brings in so many complexities to things. Because what he did was arguably disgusting, heinous, and absolutely wrong, and on so many levels evil. I don't think anybody can deny those. And he himself didn't deny those. But he didn't ever admit to knowing why he did those. It's a fascinating battle that seems to exist within a number of these people who have done very awful things to other humans. It's fascinating. I feel like it's just an area of psychology that we as a species don't fully understand. How a person can be born into the world and be primed for everything in a normal life, but instead veer off on this very dark, twisted way. There are diagnoses that help clarify things. There are theories that help clarify things. But when it really boils down to it, we're still left wondering because we don't fully grasp our own minds. And the saying goes, if our brains were so simple that we could fully grasp them, we ourselves would be too simple to do so. Until we have some form of scientific revelation and leap forward, I don't know that we'll be able to genuinely understand why a person does these things, but we can rather understand why they perceive the world the way they do and what leads them to do these things as from their perspective. It's an interesting thing. Regardless, let's continue.
I still don't understand it. I don't know why.
What would you do with the dead animals, Jeff? You would pick the carcass.
I still don't understand. It's still micro no shakes, a little shrug in there, all still indicating that. And then when you see another postural change, as he's wrapped up that statement, he switches around. His posture changes. It's going from the answering of a question, that specific question, to receiving another question. Role change, posture change. Makes sense. It's a repeatable pattern. Again, look for it in your own life. It'll pop up. You'll see it. It becomes very hard to miss. Let's continue.
The carcasses up from the road and take them back into the woods.
Take them back in the woods, skin them sometimes, slit them all the way open, look at the organs, feel them. There was a sort of general excitement for me. I don't know why. It was exciting to see.
I don't know why, and then you hear a shallow, shaky breath come in there. It's an indicator of agitation. Whether or not it's a negative or positive agitation is difficult to be able to say. It feels like contextually, perhaps this would be a mixture of both. It could be that possibility of like, it's a negative agitation because, yeah, it's an arguably unique characteristic to want to take animals and go into the forest and skin them and touch their insides and get all feely in there. That's interesting. But with that, he's saying verbally that he was excited by that. And so that shaky breath, that shallow shaky breath, that agitation could also be in the vein of excitement, which synchronizes with what he's saying verbally. So we're hearing that, we're understanding that even with these people that psychologically function vastly different, there's something different about the psychological processing of Jeffrey Dahmer as opposed to the everyday person. Even with that, the nonverbal communication that they show and display can oftentimes still be indicative of the psychological processing behind it. It's still very fascinating. It's important to make note of, even just for research and data purposes. Let's continue.
One of your dad's biggest questions is when you began to slip away, when you crossed over into this world of obsession.
Talking about this, you see the dad nod. Yes, these are things I said. And you see Jeffrey kind of move around. Another reposturing. This could be being uncomfortable in that situation or with what's being said. Perhaps he didn't want to disappoint his dad, and that's still something that's psychologically plaguing him, despite where things have already ended up for him as an adult. Regardless, we're seeing that nonverbal dynamic between the two. Let's continue.
Or dark fantasy from which you just couldn't return. Can you pinpoint that? Is there a sense for when that really began to happen with you, Jeff?
I think it was around age 14 or 15. Started having obsessive thoughts of violence intermingled with sex. And it just got worse and worse. I didn't know how to tell anyone about it, so I didn't. I just kept it all inside.
All right, so pausing here to add some context to Jeffrey's life. Jeffrey obviously had a proclivity towards other men, which was not a thing that was acceptable at the time. So he felt very isolated with his own sexuality, felt like he could not approach it with his parents, could not approach it with his teachers. Already there was that aspect of things. Along with that, he had this other darker interest and fascination with the internal functionings of various living beings. At the time, it was only animals. But as is nature's wont, a certain level is never enough. You always have to go to the next level. As you get used to a certain threshold, you have to seek the next level of threshold to be able to achieve the same result. So he has that, and then he has his already very stifled sexual exploration and interest. So then, for a young, growing mind, he married the two together, which to me, it seems to be the very small origins of what he ended up being, was these two avenues that he felt unable to express to anybody for fear of ostracization or for fear of perhaps even punishment, something along those lines. He kept those locked away inside, but they continued to grow, and he continued to hit the thresholds that he hit until eventually, even by just natural order of things, he had to reach the next step, which was taking it from this fantasy realm to the realm beyond. Now, there are ways to release this pent-up energy that he was feeling that are healthier, and there are ways to talk to people and find communities and things that allow you to express yourself in specific ways that maybe others won't understand, but you could find the community who does, who's supportive, and keeps you on a moral pathway while doing so rather than an amoral one. So there is that possibility, but for him specifically, it didn't seem as though he had those outlets available to him. He ended up internalizing it, and it festered, and it started to come out in ways that he specifically and only exclusively could control. Again, centered around this mindset of control. And from his childhood growing up, if you have watched the other videos, you know that he had a very controlled childhood. It's an unfortunate situation. Let's continue.
Do you have any sense for where that was coming from?
No. No, I've talked with a few psychologists about it. They have their theories, but they don't have any concrete answers either.
Do you have a theory?
No, not really. I don't know where it came from. I probably will never know. But I never dreamed that it would become a reality.
Comprehend.
Fascinating. And again, with the disclaimer that Jeffrey Dahmer did monstrous, evil, horrific things and ruined so many people's lives and the families around them and acquaintances, everything. It's unfortunate to still hear a person trying to work through life with these various characteristics and psychological processings that they themselves don't fully understand why it is the way they function. A reason that I believe he's being authentic is due to the nonverbal communication that is synchronized with his answers. There is the possibility that he's controlling it. Again, these size of movements are controllable. So he is shaking his head like that, and it is fairly macro, but it is synchronized with what he's saying, and it stays synchronized contextually with what he stuck to throughout all of his interviews, is that he accepted responsibility but did not know fully as to why. At some point, Jeffrey, a young child, felt so isolated that he felt he could not express some of these interests in a healthy, moral way. That's not okay. And so because of that, he festers and becomes the monster that he did, and that's even less okay. And the entire situation is not okay. It's not okay. And non-verbally speaking, it just adds weight to that. Let's continue.
What was it, Jeff, that took you over the edge, do you think, and made you take this from the world of fantasy into reality?
From 15 on, I had this reoccurring fantasy of meeting a hitchhiker on the road, and of taking him hostage and doing what I wanted with him. About 3 years later, I was 18 years old, driving home. I saw this hitchhiker about a mile from my house. Thought to myself, should I stop and pick him up, or should I just keep on going? I wish I just kept on going, but I didn't. Turned around, picked him up, and
We're hearing agitation start to flood into his verbal patterns as there's deeper sighs and a lot of ums and uhs and hesitations. The agitation is very clear. Non-verbally speaking, we're starting to see some fidgeting around here with his fingers, as those are self-soothing gestures. And then even further down, we're seeing his legs start to have activation as well. He's feeling very uncomfortable with this situation, and it's showing in his nervous system through these self-soothing agitation gestures cropping up in various areas. He doesn't like talking about this situation, even though he's very willingly talking about it. We can rely more reasonably on his nonverbal communication for being less on board with speaking about it than he's verbally giving indicators for. Let's continue.
that's when the nightmare became a reality. It just seemed so bizarre to me that this obsession that I had been thinking about and wanting, just all the parts are there, and they make it possible to make it happen.
What happened after you took him to the house?
The house was empty. My mother was up in Chippewa Falls with her family, and my dad was living in a rented motel about 5 miles away due to the divorce. And I pretty much had the place to myself. I was drinking a lot during that time, and just
I find that fascinating. While he's talking about, while he's talking about where the parents were located, I was watching to see his dad's nonverbal communication to see if there was anything that was being revealed to his dad during that time. From what I was seeing nonverbally, there were no responses to what he was stating, letting me know that his dad knew everything that has already been talked about here, which makes sense even contextually with what they said earlier on. All of this has been covered in so many interviews and so many media outlets that by this point that there was no point in continuing to talk about it. And then at the very end, he's saying that he had the house pretty much all to himself, and he has a little tiny no shake in that. To me, that pushes away from him having the house to himself. And even verbally speaking, he says that he pretty much had it to himself. The qualifiers of pretty much, to me, that pushes me to ask why those qualifiers and why that nonverbal communication? Who else was there? Was there somebody else there? And if not, why offer those qualifiers? Logically speaking, that to me indicates that there must have been somebody else there at times. I'm not sure. Regardless, non-verbally speaking, he's indicating that he did not have the house fully to himself the entire time. It's a very fascinating thing. I don't have an outlet or an answer as to why he does display that there. I don't know that we'll ever know if perhaps another person visited the house, if there were somebody else involved with this entire situation, or if this was just nonverbal communication that was happening without a psychological reasoning behind it. Not positive. Regardless, Let's continue on the rest of the interview.
And just, I don't know, looking for something to, some way to find some fulfillment, some pleasure. And I acted on my fantasies, and that's where everything went wrong.
This was the summer of 1978 when you took your first victim.
Right. Once it happened the first time, it just seemed like it had control of my life from there on in.
Okay, so that's where this portion of the interview ends. Again, we're left with this sentiment that Jeffrey himself felt like he was out of control for much of it, that the compulsion that he had to do XYZ was so overwhelming that he himself did not have the willpower to push against it, which is not unheard of in psychology in general. The very concept of addiction shows that many people simply do not have the willpower to be able to break cycles that they find themselves in, especially when those cycles in some way, even if it's to their ultimate detriment, give them a level of fulfillment. What we're left then wondering as audiences, as psychologists and scientists, is asking the question, is this form of action, these very vile, evil, horrible things that Jeffrey did, were they an addiction to him? Did he have an actual psychological choice? Or was this something that was a conscious decision that he made each and every time? All that we're left doing is asking these questions of why do some people find these evil, heinous things irresistible when so many of the rest of the population are completely turned away from it? Even at the end of this little blip here, I'm still asking the same things because non-verbally speaking, he showed no indicators to push me away from what he was saying. To me, it feels like instances like this feel like we have a missing puzzle piece. And I don't know what that puzzle piece is. And unfortunately, I don't know that anybody alive knows what that puzzle piece is and what clicks into place and suddenly makes the entire thing clear and makes the entire thing something that's addressable. So that's the analysis of this little blip here. All of this is just adding more data to the pool of what we have in regards to serial killers and various people who do arguably evil things. So let me know in the comments of this video if there's somebody else that you would like me to do an analysis on. If you would like me to continue down this interview itself, there are more questions that are asked. It's a much longer interview. This is only about a third of the interview itself. So if you would like to see more of it, let me know. And if there are any other videos outside of that you would like to be able to see, again, the comments is a great place to be able to do that. I have both a Patreon and a membership if you would like to be able to support me a little bit extra beyond just viewing the channel videos and subscribing. I do appreciate it if you do that. There is no pressure to do that at all, but thank you if you do. I also have a link tree linked at the top of this description that will allow you to follow towards my socials and towards a landing page that has my credentials, a reading list, and backstory towards getting into this avenue of nonverbal communication as a career. So if you're interested in following a similar pathway, go ahead and follow that link in the description of this video. But without further ado, that's all that I've got for the day. My name is Logan, and you have been oh so awesome as you always are, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers, guys.